All right, cool beans. Welcome to the weekly wrap up, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we're going to be doing a fundamental session to, catch up on the fundamentals for the last few weeks or whatnot and going forward. We got Carmen on with us tonight. So she's going to give us that fundamental sauce as always. So without further ado, let me give a quick disclaimer. This is not financial advice. Anything that we share throughout this analysis tonight is for educational purposes only. I repeat, this is in no way financial advice. Anything that we share throughout this analysis tonight is for educational purposes. Cool beans. Cool beans. So without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to Carmen so she can give us that saucy Carmen. It's all yours. You talking, we can't hear you. All right, there you go.
Okay, cool. Hey everybody. Um, I have, gosh, it's quite a bit of news that has been transpiring that I'll go over. And man, let's see. I don't even know where to start, to be honest with you, because it's just been so much stuff. Um, um, let's see here. Um, all right, so I have a list of things. So first we can talk about um I don't think we've talked since the last assassination attempt. Um so honestly, at this point in time, um it's okay. So I think that since the last one, um there have been people that have said that they feel like it's fake. There are people that feel like, it's a very real thing. Regardless, it's nothing to play around with. It's not cool just because of the fact that, you're talking about somebody's life and you're talking about somebody's family, um, and democracy at the same time. So, um, whenever, we start talking about events like that, it might seem like it's all fun and games. It might seem funny at the time, but it's not. Um, and if it is one of those things where it's like an attempt um, to gain sympathy, um, obviously things like that come to light and people kind of see through it, no matter what side you're on. Um, we have Israel and Iran fighting again. Um, that situation, in my opinion, is one that has been going on for thousands of years, will continue to go on. And I think that that situation is not going to get any easier, especially with the um, oil situation. So if you kind of think back to the last time that this was going on, we had Saudi Arabia wanting to. Hold on for a second. I'm sorry. Um, I have to walk through the house. Um, so with Saudi Arabia and the oil situation, that kind of sparked it the last time. And everyone was like, okay, well, hopefully Iran doesn't get too upset with Saudi Arabia. And then you start talking about then who is a friend of who. Um, and then allies start um, pitting themselves against one another. And then when that happens, it ends up being a situation where you have to choose and pick sides. And when you pick sides in a situation like that, it's never going to be a good thing, because no matter what side you're on in this situation, um, it's not going to be a good outcome, I should say. That's only because allies on both sides have strong military forces. They have the means to um, sounds really bad, but to pretty much cause chaos and destruction around the world. Um, if the U.S. were to step in and get involved in this situation, can definitely say that it's not going to make the situation easy. Um, if any of Iran's allies were to step in, and the allies of those countries were to step in, then you can definitely say that we would have a lot of major world issues happening to the point where it could possibly, depending on how soon it happened, it could disrupt the election or the inauguration, or it could just potentially just disrupt how the world functions in general, just because the powers on both sides, again, are very powerful forces. Um, a lot of people have been talking about the weather. So, um, I'll come back to the hurricanes in a second. But aside from the hurricanes, no one's really talking about um the solar flares. So when we start talking about the weather, we start talking about, what kinds of things are going to really be disruptive. War is disruptive, but not being able to communicate at all is very disruptive. Um, so, let's see, when was it? Maybe earlier this year. It could have possibly been last year. I talked about the sun cycle and solar flares and how every so often we get these solar cycles and how these solar cycles really start to affect business. It affects the business cycle and it affects how people do things. Um, People don't realize just how important it is for us to have a stable sun solar cycle. If we don't have a stable solar cycle, that means that when um, it comes to communications, you can have the best cell phone in the world, and you could even have a satellite phone. But if the satellites are disrupted by solar flares, your phone is really no good. No one's phone is going to be any good. So we have to take a step back and really start to think about what is it that's important to us, A. And then two, if we know that these things are out there that could be disruptive, what are we going to do about it? You can't really do anything about the sun. You can't control the sun. You can't control these solar flares. But if you know that they're coming up, having a really good, solid infrastructure is what's needed to actually help. Um, Having a solid infrastructure is what's really needed in order to help keep phones working properly. So, we can talk about it from that perspective. But then just speaking about infrastructure, um, now we can come back to the hurricanes. um, a lot of places have realized that their infrastructure isn't as good and isn't as strong as they once thought it was. It's all well and good and it's cool to talk about um, policy. It's all well and good to talk about, politics and stuff like that. But, there are people whose lives will never be the same. People whose lives will be disrupted for at least the next year, if not more, because of failed infrastructure. I can personally attest to this because, I live in North Carolina, temporarily, um, and my, um, where I live is north of Asheville. And it's kind of interesting because, um, I have easy access to the highway. But when you start talking about not even being able to use the highway and not even being able to get in and out of town, I live in the main part of the city, um, at least north of the city, the main part anyway. But when you start going into the outskirts and you start going out to places where um, you could either lose cell phone service or it ends up being a part of town where you're driving 45 minutes to get to the next closest place. When that happens, it's like, oh wow, okay. There's a huge gap here in time between cities, large gaps between cell phone service areas. So um, you can look up Hot Springs, North Carolina. It's one of those areas that is kind of tourist famous. It's like they claim to be one of the only places in North Carolina where you could like bathe in like true hot springs water. It's similar to the experience you might get going to like Jamaica or St. Lucia, being able to like swim in hot springs. Um, but in hot springs, once you
Because I want to play music. I'll check your
okay,
line for you. Okay.
okay,
I
okay,
don't want to disturb.
okay, okay, okay. Thank you. Okay, sorry, my uncle is like, I'm getting ready to go to a different part of the house. One second. Okay, I am sorry. I'm back. Okay, so um hot springs. One of those areas where you go, you see it, it's lovely. It's a very beautiful place. However, if you're trying to get to the interstate from hot springs, you have to go past the French Broad River, which if you've been paying attention to the news, you've seen anything about Helene. French Broad River was one of those rivers that um, pretty much helped to contribute to a lot of the flooding. Well, you have to drive past there. And then not only that, but you also have to go through an area where for 28 minutes you don't have any cell phone service. And I mean none. Like you can try to connect via satellite mode on an iPhone and you might be able to stream music for a little bit, but even then, that signal goes out and you just completely lose it. So, those are the kind of areas that are in North Carolina in that part of the state. So when we talk about infrastructure, when we start talking about policies and we hear politicians talking about helping to build better infrastructure, in my mind, those are the things that need to be better because how is it that, we're living in 2024 and there are areas that are like that? Um, those are where the infrastructure conversations need to be happening. Um, so, we can talk about a lot of things when it comes to um, news and how things have been happening lately. And I feel like to a certain extent, all of it is going to come back to the election in some way, shape, form, or fashion, just because, mm, I mean, that's what people are thinking about right now. That's where people's minds are. And um, honestly, when it comes down to the world news that we have right now, I can honestly say that most of it, if not all of it, we could turn around and bring it back to the election. And we will on some later calls. I think um maybe the last week, like right before the election, we can hit on some things. Um, but I honestly feel like um ports, some of those negotiations have started to happen, but that's not just a global thing. That ends up being a systemic thing. I mean, sorry, that's not just a domestic thing here in the US. It ends up being a systemic thing across the planet. And um, any issue where you have a president that could get involved um, and try to um, help people through, help the union through negotiations, it's always one of those issues you want to pay attention to because you know at that point in time it's critical. Um, Even though there are some negotiations, if you look at what each side was asking for or trying to negotiate through, those issues are issues that are way beyond money. Yeah, we can talk about it from a financial standpoint, but when you really start to look at the mechanics of business, how things happen, who controls the ports, who controls pricing, the companies, the countries involved, it becomes a really big thing. And you start to realize that it's not as simple as you once thought. And then that issue bubbles up and becomes a bigger issue when then you add on top of that an Israel Iran war slash, tussle where they're fighting again. Okay, they're fighting again. How does that even relate to ports? Well, all of these news items are related in the fact that they're going to cause delays in production. They're going to cause increase in pricing. It's going to be a very indirect, but at the same time, direct way to cause inflation and affect the stable pricing model that the Fed has set up and has told us that they were going to try to move forward with. So, ports, delay in production, delay in distribution. Then you have Israel Iran fighting. And then this causes a ripple effect on oil. Well, you need oil for transportation. These transporters need oil derivatives, whether it's jet fuel, kerosene, diesel, gasoline, um, any of the derivatives. You're going to need that. But at the same time, allies of Iran could easily manipulate the price. So, in order to get back at Israel in an indirect way through their allies, um, oil prices could be dropped. I know that sounds like so weird because you would think raising gas prices, raising oil prices would be the way to go. But no, when you control the distribution and when you control pricing outside of the US, the US can kind of control to an extent some of its own pricing, but we still get a lot of oil from overseas. So when you say, well, we're going to just flood the market with oil, that means that people who buy oil from us, now don't have an incentive to do so. Why? Because the oil price has dropped and they can go elsewhere and get cheaper oil. They can get oil closer to home. But then it also means that if they're still going to buy oil from us, we have to play with the price. It's almost like, two gas stations across from each other, and one gas station is $3 and the other one is $2.90. Well, people are more inclined to go to $2.90. Why not say 10 cents? So the one that's at $3 is going to come down to $2.90, and not a spite, they might come down to $2.87. And so then it becomes this war of who can have the best pricing to draw in the customer. So that's that. And even more with the correlations with ports. So you have a delay in distribution, but if you're flooding the market with oil and no one is there to take the oil, and tanker ships aren't moving, planes aren't moving with product, or there's no one to offload it, even if it's there at a port or at a customs area, if no one's there to offload it, that vessel is just going to sit there. Well, if oil is being flooded and no one is able to use it, that's just going to drive down pricing even further. Then you add on top of that natural disasters. So you have natural disasters that happen. You have the southeast of the United States that has been affected. For people who trade commodities, you have already seen this. Orange juice prices, cotton prices, the price of nuts that get traded amongst farmers. All of these things because you've had severe crop disruptions that have happened, primarily in Georgia and South Carolina. Georgia and Florida. So when you start thinking about, okay, well, how is that going to further hinder distribution and production? Well, if you don't have cotton, there's a lot of things that can't get made. Cotton goes into more than just clothes. So it goes into book bags, it goes into purses, it goes into bedding, bath items, shoes, anything that's cloth, to a certain extent will have a certain percentage of cotton in it. And so in thinking about that, it's like, okay, well, we're getting ready to go into winter. You have a disruption in cotton. And it's not the main source of cotton, but when you have a disruption in one area, it trickles to other areas, especially when you start talking about local farmers being affected. So then we can shift to North Carolina and we can start talking about a lot of the disruptions that happen in North Carolina. So in Western North Carolina, this would be the prime time for tourism. Most people come to Western North Carolina in the fall, see the leaves change, they go to Biltmore, they get married, they have lots of fall events in Western North Carolina during this time of the year, or starting around now, this time of the year, that have been disrupted, aren't going to happen. So that's money out of all these states that were affected by Helene, that's really going to be disrupted. But some of the other major disruptions that people aren't talking about, some people are, disruption to chips and electronics, disruption to lithium battery making. No one thinks about North Carolina when it comes to these things. There are also salt mines that are in Western North Carolina that pretty much help furnish ionic salt compounds that help go into chemical making plants like 3M in the Raleigh Triangle area. They use these salts to help make compounds to help make their products. All of that's been disrupted. So when we were talking about Nvidia. The market had been talking about Nvidia for a long time. The only silver lining in there being a disruption, if you can even call it one, is the fact that um, there is now a transition that's happening in the chip sector where companies are upgrading chips. They're in the process of keeping some chips, upgrading the others, not really focusing too much on building out or growing their network or their, in company infrastructure. It's just upgrading what they currently have. I feel like more companies will actually start to expand their infrastructure after the election. It's a lot easier to do those kinds of things once you actually know who's in office and what kind of policies you're going to have to deal with. So, from that perspective, it's a good thing. However, when you think about these areas in North Carolina that are affected, um, and it's a couple of areas in the mountains, a few areas that are like in the foothills, and the areas that are like considered the foothills, it's like in between, I guess you could say in between Asheville and Charlotte. And then you have a few areas that are actually close to Charlotte. So um, that thriving infrastructure, again, has been disrupted. And because of that, now you have other markets and other areas that are going to be disrupted. So this whole thing with chips and the solar flares, to me, I kind of laugh a little bit because it's like we knew, and when I say we, I mean people who like read, research, follow solar cycles, kind of knew like, okay, this was coming. Because solar flares happen on a cycle, on a rotation. And so to have a chip disruption coming at the same time we have an increase now in solar flares going into the end of the year, beginning of next year, is interesting because while I did just say that companies weren't going to expand their infrastructure and they were just upgrading it, the one thing I did not say is the fact that now, if you have damage to infrastructure, you're going to have to completely replace your infrastructure. Well, what if you don't have a chip? What if you don't have the electronic capability to upgrade your chips because you don't have pure quartz? What if you don't have the ability to do supercooling? What if you don't have the ability to make cars because you don't have the lithium? What if you don't have the ability to power technology because you don't have the lithium or the pure quartz? And so now you're in this cycle where you're just sitting and you're waiting. What if there becomes a backlog and people are sitting around waiting? Who gets chips first? Who gets the infrastructure first? Then it becomes a battle of who feels like they're the most important entity. Um, you don't ever want to get to that point because then it just becomes a fight in my mind for no reason. But nonetheless, um, I really do feel like a lot of the things that we have going on now, globally, are not easy things to overcome. They're things that I think people should pay attention to. Um, when we think about pricing here in the United States, I know a lot of people think that how we do things is unfair. Um, how we do things is very one-sided. But the Fed, mm, now more so than ever, they have a very crucial job. Yeah, we just got a nice rate cut, and It's wonderful, it's amazing. But are they going to have to be more aggressive? Are they going to be able to keep pace? Are they going to have to be more aggressive with the pace, depending on what happens? Because all of these things that I was just talking about, like I said, cause a disruption in the cycle, which when that cycle is disrupted, then you end up needing to compensate on the back end because those disruptions cause price increases. Those price increases can't be helped in some ways. Um, so then the Fed is trying to play with rates so that corporations can get more money to help in some ways balance out their books, or to just go out and get more raw materials so that then they can actually boost supply and try to help the marketplace to hopefully balance itself out. So, um, those are some of the things that I'm looking at. Those are how I conceptualize and connect a lot of things that are going on. Um, and we talked about this a long, 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 long time ago. But the fact that a lot of CEOs have left really good companies, and I mean CEOs who, in my opinion, if we weren't in an election year, they probably would not have left. Um, but companies that have really good books, companies that don't have any issues, CEOs are just leaving. It's like, why are you leaving? What's going on that you're leaving? Um, and there's a lot of research out there, um, in the financial world anyway, that talks about how in a year where you have a lot of political uncertainty, and not only that, but when you have a risk of a market downturn, CEOs leave. No one wants to be stuck with someone being able to say, "Hey, you you were the CEO when the recession happened, and you were in charge of XYZ company." No CEO wants that on their hands. So it's a lot easier just to go ahead and say, you know what, I'm gonna turn this over to somebody else. I'm gonna let them handle it. And should things go wrong, well, guess what? It's on them. That's gonna be their name in the in the record books, not mine. So um when I start to think about how things are going, where we're going from here, um, that's also another thing that I think about, because it's not easy for a CEO to just leave a really good company. But when they do, you can best believe there's a good reason why they did. And profits, in a situation like this, a lot of times don't matter to the CEO, because if it did, they would stay. It's not about that. Right now, it's about preservation. Because when you're not in the position of CEO anymore, you can dump stock however you want. Um, and you're in a better position to be able to do things more freely without scrutiny, from the media, from the Fed. So, um, I definitely believe that we are in one of those periods where, even though we have the Fed trying to do what they can do to change, um, not only rates, and help keep the market afloat and stabilized, we are in one of those periods of time where we have um, a recession uncertainty, and it doesn't make it any easier that we have all of these other world events going on at the same time.
Cool beans. then, well, that pretty much gonna sum it up for the night, guys. That'll do fundamentals. We're about to bring it to a close.